you so much for joining us. We're going to get going. And just one moment, please. All right. My name's Jenna Diaz-Gonzalez, and I'm the program manager with the Denver Metro Chamber Leadership Foundation. This Virtual Voices series is co-created with our partner Tide, which is Talent, Inclusion, Engagement, and Diversity, and is curated for those throughout our network and the broader community. This is your first time joining us. Thank you so much. And to all of our returning attendees, thank you for continuing to be part of these important discussions. Before we get going, I'd like to acknowledge the land that we stand on, which is our tradition. And I like to lift this up particularly because I'm grateful to be a guest on this land. And growing up in the Grand Canyon, surrounded by Indigenous leaders, I've made it part of my personal commitment to remind all of us of the history of the land that we stand on. And so I'd like to take the time to recognize the Ute, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho tribes from whom this land was taken and who were displaced. In this spirit, I'd also like to recognize our contemporary tribal nations that are still present with us today and express my gratitude for their continued contributions. I offer this up, reminding myself and others to honor our Indigenous past, present, and future, and in a commitment to deepen our relationships with this community. So thank you for taking a moment to join me in this acknowledgement. And now pivoting into our Zoom and our virtual housekeeping. This session is being recorded and will be emailed to each of you after the session, and will be posted also on our YouTube channel and our website. Please stay muted until you have a question for our speaker. We recommend that you use speaker view for today's session, and we encourage you to engage via the chat feature throughout the session. We really like to make sure that these are interactive opportunities for you all. So feel free to post reflections, resources, and questions throughout the program, and we'll monitor the chat. If you have any technical questions, you can chat Satya Akia from our team. You'll see her as co-host or host on there. And if you get the next slide, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors that make this possible today. Molson Coors, Southwest, and TIAA. Thank you so much for your partnership in this important work. And a very huge thank you to our Virtual Voices Planning Committee. Without the wealth of knowledge of these leaders, we would not be here engaging in these conversations. These are the individuals who have put together these incredible sessions and brought to you these speakers. So thank you. And as you know, we've been on a journey for the last several months, really diving into the history of race and racism within our country. And many of you have teed up for us where we take personal action. And so today, leaning into the personal side of our journey and development, we're going to hone in on inclusive leadership. We have an incredible session lined up for you today. It's going to be an opportunity for you to really reflect on your role within our commitment to building practices that help us all advance here in our community, our leaders, our workplace. It's going to be great. And we've led you, or I guess we've presented to each of you some guiding principles for today. So next slide. You've probably seen these before, and so I'll go over them very briefly. Assume and bring good intentions to the work that we're here today. Listen with curiosity for new understanding. Expect and accept lack of closure. Make space for mistakes, really bringing that grace to ourselves and to others. And acknowledge the trauma and resist re-traumatization when we talk about some of those difficult subjects. So thank you, and we're always looking for feedback on some of these guiding principles that we offer up. All right, I know you're excited to get going, and so I'd like to introduce Dr. Michael Benitez, the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion at Metropolitan State University, who is a member of our Virtual Voices Planning Committee. He's going to lead us through and introduce our speaker for today. So thank you so much for guiding our conversation. Dr. Benitez, please take it away.
Thank you, Jenna. Thank you very much. Usa Weyuwat Yaudiri, Mike Benitez of Afro-Taino Arawak descent and son of the island of Borinquen, always appreciating the land acknowledgement. Good morning to all who have joined us, and thank you as usual for entrusting virtual voices with your time. Today's speaker is Dr. Brenda J. Allen, a seasoned educator, scholar, practitioner, whose name is a familiar one throughout Denver, the state of Colorado, the nation, and international for her work on intercultural development and DEI. Professor Emerita Brenda J. Allen retired in April 2019 as the Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Colorado, Denver, and the Anschutz Medical Campus. Dr. Allen has a track record of scholarship, teaching, service, mentorship, and training related to organizational communication, social identity, power, and leadership. Last year, she launched a global online course entitled Inclusive Leadership: The Power of Workplace Diversity, that is receiving international acclaim. As a DEI consultant, she offers high-rated workshops, facilitations, keynote speeches, and coaching on a variety of diversity and inclusion topics. Dr. Allen has received numerous honors, including her colleagues at CU Denver, establishing a Diversity and Inclusion Scholarship and Leadership Award in her name. Today, her session is going to focus on the very important and necessary topic of inclusive leadership, a topic that workplaces following the murder of George Floyd have begun to take more seriously. But to mark the moment, these are also issues that have been ongoing for quite some time, even prior to the death of George Floyd. Yet, as the combination of these words have throughout the past become a normal talk among organizational leaders, and even as there is a body of robust research addressing inclusion in organizations going back half a century, leaders continue to struggle with understanding what exactly is inclusive leadership. What are the central tenets to this high-level inclusive practice? Inclusive leadership, could be defined as a type of style of leadership where leaders who are aware of their own biases and preferences actively seek out and consider different views and perspectives to inform better decision-making. It enables the effective and structural functioning of diverse work groups in ways that are not sufficiently addressed by other forms of leadership. Different leaders, depending on workplace and organizational context, may define this concept differently in their own ways, and that is fine. However, inclusive leadership, like many other concepts, is and should be informed and be grounded in a series of tenets informed by the work that is out there. Yet missing in the ways we understand it are the topics of equity, diversity, power, and history. And Dr. Allen is gonna hit on an array of ways that we can consider this work. It requires of leaders to serve as stewards of diversity and equity work, ambassadors to diversity and inclusion, never really missing an opportunity to speak on the significance and importance of this work. Inclusive leaders are at peace with and accept vulnerability and model a behavior through their humility and understand and adapt to various cultural norms, as opposed to seeking groups and individuals to adapt or assimilate into existing or outdated and old-fashioned structures often created by homogeneous groups. Inclusive leaders are curious and they're great listeners. They take responsibility, they validate, and they affirm different understandings. They're immensely reflective, have the courage to own lifelong learning and growth, and they not only seek collaboration, but lean on the perspectives of others, even as they might disagree. And most importantly, and through an equity and inclusion lens, inclusive leaders seek to cultivate a spirit of openness and are intentional about the work they do. And lastly, before I hand the mic over to Dr. Allen, inclusive leaders show up with love. They show up with true radical love. And it's truly my pleasure to introduce Dr. Brenda J. Allen, because we're dear friends. She's been a colleague for a while. I think she does some of the most remarkable work out there around inclusive leadership. And she truly leads with that radical love that I'm referring to. So with further ado, Dr. Allen, please, if everybody can join me in welcoming Dr. Allen here to the virtual platform. She's going to go ahead and take it from here. We're going to provide some time later, perhaps about 5 minutes or so for some questions. If you have some questions in the time being, as was mentioned, put it in the chat, and she will do her best to look at the questions and address them as part of the presentation. Thank you all very much. Dr. Allen, my dear sister, the stage is all yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Benitez, my dear bruv. I actually am feeling emotional in a good way in terms of how you introduced me. I'm so grateful to you. As you know, you are why I'm here doing this presentation. You recommended me, you encouraged me. Thanks to everyone from the Denver Metro Chamber Leadership Foundation and TIDE, and there are many of you, for everything you've done to help make this presentation today, as well as for the whole Virtual Voices series. Hello and welcome to everyone. Please open your mics, or if you want to use your reactions or whatever. This is not rhetorical. One of my cultural backgrounds is very much about interaction. So, hey, what's up, y'all?
Good morning. Afternoon.
Hello.
Hey.
Hello. Glad to
Hi
be
there.
here.
Good morning.
Hey.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so very much again for, of all the things you could be doing, you're here with us today to, for me to help us think about this collaborative series and to add to it by really thinking about fostering leaders who can impart positive changes through systems and organizations and create more inclusive and equitable workplaces. Here's our work. Oh, excuse me, I need to share my screen. So here's our plan for today. It's going to be somewhat interactive, as I mentioned already. Please feel free to use the chat to me only, to everyone, and even among yourselves. I trust that you will, any kind of interactions you have among yourselves will at least be somewhat related to why we're here today. If you have something you want to share with me separately, I may share that with the group, but I won't identify who it came from. We're going to have at least one time for you to do some reflection on your own. We're going to have a breakout session. And again, if you have any questions, please pose them in the chat box. I want to start today with clarifying some of the key concepts. Dr. Benitez was spot on in terms of there tend to be different connotations, denotations of terms we throw around routinely. And one of the things that I became very, very intentional about and actually known about, especially when I was in leadership positions at the university, was saying, well, what do we mean when we say diversity, right? Or when you say race, what do you really mean? And I also try to give conceptualization. So I'm going to share some perspectives in terms of what is leadership, what is inclusive leadership, what is an important quality of inclusive leadership, hint, hint, self-awareness. I'm going to focus on that. What are traits of highly inclusive leaders? And I'm going to solicit and offer recommendations in terms of a so what, now what, with the title of Cultivating Inclusive Leadership. I'm going to close with the call to action. And I want you throughout our time together to think about how we are exploring this notion of cultivating inclusive leadership. Specifically, what are implications to inform and guide efforts for racial equity? So be ready for that, please. So I'm curious. By show of hands or using the reaction, whatever works for you, how many of you are gardeners? And that can be loosely defined, like, you know, you're actually farmers and have an agricultural background to you have a little herbal plant, right? How about, are any of you parents, guardians, caretakers? All right. Anyone in a committed relationship? All right, what do these have in common? Well, to succeed, you need to cultivate them. As we share our time today, reflecting on inclusive leadership, let's consider cultivating as our, wait for it, root metaphor. Let's be grounded in the notion of cultivating inclusive leadership for the 21st century. And I want you to think a bit about cultivate. And what might come to your mind when I say cultivate? When I have time with groups, I actually work through this in terms of actual word association. But for today, because we have limited time, just think about, what do you think about, what do you feel when I say cultivate? Why do we cultivate anything? What are the different kinds of things we cultivate in addition to what I shared a moment ago? How do we optimize success when we strive to cultivate? What might be some challenges of cultivating? So this notion of cultivating is a useful analogy as we explore inclusive leadership. Cultivating, the definition of it is to foster the growth of something, to improve by labor, care, or study. So to cultivate something takes hard work, persistence. To do it well, you should rely on resources. You need to be flexible. You have some vision of an outcome, but you're flexible in terms of what may happen. Anticipated and unanticipated challenges, celebrating small successes, dealing with uncertainty. To do it well ought to be collaborative. Bottom line, when you set out to cultivate something, you believe in it. And that's why I'm using that, again, root metaphor of cultivate as we talk about inclusive leadership in the 21st century. Now, as we go forward, in addition to the guiding principles, and by the way, these obviously overlap with those guiding principles, I want to ask if you will agree on 3 things: to be fully present, to be here and now. All of us have things that are waiting for us after this, things that happened before now, things up the road, etc. And it can be a challenge to be present. And these are also fundamental. As my good bruv listed many of the characteristics of inclusive leaders, this idea of being fully present, that's one of the best gifts you could give to someone. And when you're with them, is to be fully with them. So I ask you to agree to be present, to be aware of, self-aware of what you're feeling and what you're thinking, being mindful for anything that might evoke any kind of emotion for you: frustration, guilt, shame, anger, sadness, even excitement, happiness. I invite you to be grateful that you care enough to be emotional. We get kind of disciplined not to strive to be rational, which is really unrealistic. And some people actually could not care less, don't have emotions. So I encourage you, if you have feelings, to be grateful to that, about that for yourself. And remember, one of our goals is to use what you learn to make a difference. And so responding to emotions is one way to be more committed and guided to affect change. Second agreement I'm asking you for is to be curious. And that was covered also in the guiding principles. With curiosity, which you'll see, and you may already know, is one of the 6 signature traits of highly inclusive leaders, is an eagerness to learn or know something, to be inquisitive, to be ready and willing to consider new ideas or perspectives, and even to look anew, bring fresh eyes to something that you already know as you relearn and think about it. So to me, curiosity is the difference between, why does that matter, to, why does that matter? So I invite us all to be curious. Finally, to be engaged in communal learning. That is to say, to have a sense that we're learning and relearning together in service of a very important point about being more inclusive as leaders and why all of us are here. So I invite you to agree to that. Does everyone agree? Looks like you do. I haven't flown in a minute, but with my long legs, I try to get into the exit row seats, and then they have to look at every single person. I don't have time to do that, to look each of you in the eye, but I see that you all are agreeing to that. So let's get moving in terms of then those key concepts, starting with inclusion. Here's my definition of inclusion. Inclusion refers to processes that strive to help everyone feel valued and respected. Some of y'all may remember, I guess maybe it's still a thing, that all caps mean shouting at people. And I mean that to shout at you, everyone. Now, this definition is based on 2 pervasive perspectives on inclusion that I've observed. Assumptions, right? Again, in terms of how people work with key concepts and neglect to fully define them. So the first definition, the first perspective, the first ways that people seem to imply inclusion is that it's everyone. It's like a we are the world sort of approach. It's a one size fits all attitude. That approach doesn't consider differences between people that can affect how to value and respect them. A second and a crucial difference in terms of valuing and respecting persons is dominant as contrasted with non-dominant groups. I'm confident that you all are familiar with this concept, but just briefly, you know that most social identity categories, gender, race, class, age, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability status, nationality, social class, etc., consist of dominant and non-dominant classifications. That is to say, some groups are much more likely to have unearned privilege, entitlement, etc., while others do not, just by virtue of their being members of these groups. Quick example would be men and masculinity under the category of gender tend to be the dominant group. Masculinity, ways of doing, knowing, etc., tend to be the ones that implicitly and explicitly we follow in organizational settings. And all other gender classifications would be considered non-dominant, much more likely to experience discrimination, oppression through systems, through individual behaviors, through policies, practices, and procedures. So the first view on inclusion would say when we say gender, it's just everybody. We do, it's the same. A second view of inclusion focuses only on efforts for members of non-dominant groups. So these are, again, those who are likely to experience discrimination, can reasonably anticipate it and then behave accordingly due to their identity. Limited opportunities, less represented, especially the hierarchy, go into hierarchies, et cetera. So the second view of inclusion honors that one size definitely does not fit all. And it also really stresses inclusion and equity designed specifically for members of groups with the history and current possibilities of exclusion, and for those who have had limited access to resources and roles due to oppressive systems. So our definition intentionally allows for both of these perspectives. It's a both and. And so our processes that help everyone feel valued and respected allows and even requires leaders to sometimes, in fact, most of the times, focus more on certain groups than others, especially to center our attention on non-dominant groups. And those can vary in addition to protected class. They also vary in terms of actual ways that matter for a particular organizational setting. I'm working with a police department, and I've learned that sworn and non-sworn, or commissioned and non-commissioned, that's a really important difference in terms of hierarchy. Someone has raised their hands. May I help you? No, or was that just an agreement? Okay, never mind. All right, so this notion then that leadership efforts, we have to keep dominant group members in mind to mitigate potential negative attitudes and responses. And the main reason we consider dominant group members is to honor our intention to value and respect everyone. I mean, it starts with that. Everyone deserves that. And we know this already, that by being intentional, then we can also get ahead of the potential for dominant groups. All of us are members or can be members of dominant groups at some point. So for me, for example, as being heterosexual, I may, in terms of any efforts regarding LGBTQ plus persons and groups, I might have some sense of, well, why are they getting attention, et cetera? That could be implicit or explicit. So the point is, you want to keep everyone in mind. Because resistance can slow down progress, again, equally as important, we want to strive that everyone feels valued and respected. Here's a quick example. I was a co-leader of a faculty mentoring program, and we offered a variety of options related to tenure and promotion processes. Excuse me. First of all, some of these were basically relevant to all faculty. And we designed options for social identity groups known to endure challenges based on systems of oppression. For example, faculty of color, that was a terminology we used at that time. Women faculty, again, terminology we used then. Based on our context, we also offer support for adjunct faculty and for science educators because they were non-dominant in that setting. So that's then our definition of inclusion. And there are, I neglected to give you my caveat that for everything I'm sharing, that obviously there's more depth. I'm going to share with you, in case you don't have it, information on my course, Sarah course on inclusive leadership. That is free with a nominal fee if you want to get a certificate. But anyway, I go into more detail with these, but then just for our purposes today, these are factors of inclusion. You want to value and respect. These are the factors to keep in mind. Very quickly, value refers to sense of worth, having worth. Individuals feel value when people treat them like they are important and useful. And there are two factors related to this, belonging and uniqueness. They are relatively self-explanatory, and worth, kind of looking at just briefly in terms of belonging, I'm sure many of you are saying belonging has emerged as a really popular topic. And I think that it has lots of traction for diversity, equity, and inclusion, but you've got to focus on it. You've got to help people understand how this matters. So with belonging, there's that sense that you can, for the most part, be yourself in these various settings. You have a sense that you can be who you are, and people view you as a member of whatever the situation may be. Uniqueness refers to having a sense of who you are particularly, right? What are your special attributes and characteristics? Both of these matter to everybody, right? Dominant and non-dominant group members, and they can have particular relevance to persons in terms of their non-dominant identities. For example, for me, when I was recruited to CU Boulder in 1989, both of these, in retrospect, both of these were in play for me in terms of some of the ways I felt early on. I didn't necessarily feel that I could, quote unquote, fully be myself in terms of expectations. Anything from ways of dressing and talking and language and terminology, et cetera, played into that. And in particular, this notion of uniqueness. So part of why I was hired was as a twofer. Y'all know about that, right? Black female, and they could check both boxes off, right? And count me in that way. And I was often called upon based on those identity categories, whether as a woman of color, a person of color, et cetera, especially because I was the only person of color in the department at that time, period. So that there's that sense of even being, like positive intentions of valuing me because I'm a Black woman, that neglected to acknowledge, which is true for all of us, there's more to me than meets the eye, even though what meets the eye also matters. So this becomes a crucial way of looking at valuing and respecting others, belonging and uniqueness. So the second one for respect, how do you respect people, is in terms of thinking about respect as due regard for the feelings, wishes, rights, or traditions of others. And there are two ways of looking at equity in terms of this work around inclusion. So equity and non-discrimination are ways to demonstrate respect and how inclusive leaders do that. As we all know, respect means different things to different people. Otis Redding wrote it, Aretha Franklin sang it, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, what? Find out what it means to me. So inclusive leaders understand that, and they also understand the difference between the golden rule and the platinum rule, right? The golden rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The platinum rule says do as they want you to, and how do you know that if you're not paying attention, if you're not even aware of that dynamic and so forth. So the two factors related to respect are equity, which is providing persons what they need to succeed and to thrive. That means you have to understand systems of oppression. You have to understand what those needs might be. You have to understand that it's not only about what they need, but it's also what they have to offer. And how do you optimize that by providing them what they need to thrive? Non-discrimination, of course, refers to in most places now, there are laws, policies, et cetera, that are about protected class groups. And so these are all really, really important variables under valuing and respecting people, right? In terms of striving to be inclusive. So with that being said, I just want to close with inclusion again. refers how I define it and process and work with it. Our process is where everyone feels valued and respected. Factors are belonging and uniqueness for valuing people, equity and non-discrimination to respect others. I'm sure you can tell, and you've probably worked with this, that there's a lot that goes into a relatively simple, straightforward notion of valuing and respecting others. When leaders succeed at cultivating these factors, individuals and groups feel highly included. Also note that inclusion is a process, it's what you do, right, to help people feel valued and respected, and it's an outcome. I feel included. So now that we've looked at inclusion very quickly, let's move on to leadership. Again, if I had time, I would do word association. When I say leadership, what do you think of? You know that leadership is and has been a widely studied topic. Yesterday, I did a Google search of leadership, which yielded 1,740,000,000 results in 0.84 seconds. Y'all see I'm using my little math skills there, right? That I could read a number with all those zeros. Anyway, conventional perspectives on leadership are embedded with implicit and explicit biases. Conventional definitions and understanding of leadership are way too exclusive. They, for the most part, are not useful and even inviting of really thinking about anyone having the potential to be a leader, as well as anyone who's engaging in leadership, how they can be inclusive. So it's inherently, I believe, exclusionary and discriminatory, even as, of course, there are different models and so forth that have much more possibility, like servant leadership, et cetera. So I'm not trashing it. And moreover, I think it's important to understand these various theories and the history of leadership as you strive to be an inclusive leader. My definition of inclusive leadership comes from Kevin Kruse, who says, leadership is a process of social influence which maximizes the efforts of others toward the achievement of a goal. Please take a look at that definition. And I would invite you in chat, right, to just type what stands out to you about that definition. Just single out words. What stands out to you about this definition of leadership? Maximizes, process, social influence, process. All right, you all are already on track. Maximizes the efforts of others, goals, knowing where you are going. Yeah, you're already on point in terms of things to really point out. First of all, the notion of maximizes, intentionality, striving to get the best of everyone. Social influence, by default or by design, we humans are influencing one another when we're interacting or engaging. So it needs to be by default, intentional, in service of valuing and respecting others. Social influence then also shifts the attention from a single leader at the top, and it really implies, you know, it's among all of us. Kruse even asserted that although leadership does require others, they do not have to be quote unquote direct reports. This also allows persons from anywhere in a group or organization to enact leadership. Leaders can emerge, exist anywhere. Furthermore, to quote Kruse again, quote, leadership does not depend on one's title, seniority, or authority. The final thing about this definition is that it refers to achieving a goal. This implies that social influence is purposeful. It has an intended outcome. If we had time, we would unpack this as well as critique it, as well as think about, you know, how do we move from here, like that notion of goal, whose goal, how is that goal created and so forth. However, right, it is important to think about with that particular definition, how it might blend in with our definition of inclusion, which then leads me to my definition of inclusive leadership. I just love synchronicity. And so I get a quote every day. Some of you may get it, conversational leadership. And the quote today said, distinguishing leadership from authority helps us begin to see that if we understand leadership as a practice, as an activity, then it becomes available to anybody, high or low, any place or position. So when I have time again, I invite colleagues and others to delve into this definition. It might be useful for you to do so later. So here we go. in terms of now how I blend those two definitions to talk about inclusive leadership. Processes of social influence that strive to value and respect everyone involved in achieving a goal, factoring all of those factors of equity, non-discrimination, uniqueness, belonging, etc. All right, so that's the definition. And I want you now to pause for 1 minute to reflect on what we've covered so far. How are you feeling? What might be some actionable items? Whatever works for you. 1 minute. Okay, thank you. Now that I've set up inclusion, leadership, inclusive leadership, I want to, before I get into some of the signature traits in the research that I draw upon for work on cultivating inclusive leadership, to talk a bit about self-awareness. A lot of work on self-awareness and leadership views it as critical for leadership, all leaders. The dictionary defines self-awareness as conscious knowledge of one's own character, feelings, motives, and desires. Self-aware individuals try to learn about various aspects of themselves, including their strengths and weaknesses, their limitations, their skills, their values, and their biases. They pay attention to their behaviors, their emotions. Again, my bruv, you led us off with some of those ways that self-awareness really, really matters. Open to finding out things about ourselves that may be hard to face. Certainly for me, I continue. Some of you are familiar with my video on TUI, thinking under the influence, right? I routinely catch myself thinking under the influence of dominant belief systems because I'm paying attention, right? When I realize, wow, why was I surprised that this young person of color during a Zoom recently had a great idea, right? Even though I didn't show it, but in my brain, I went, well, wow, that's a really good idea. And I was so, honey, why are you surprised at that? I was like, that daggone socialization, that internalized racism, there it is again. And that also increases my self-awareness of how this operates for me, increases empathy for others, and also, however, motivates me to keep doing this work and inviting others in terms of this kind of work. So inclusive leaders and self-awareness want to be better human beings. As we strive to value and respect everyone, members of dominant and non-dominant groups, try to help people from all backgrounds have a strong sense of belonging, to be known for their unique attributes and characteristics. They're advocates of equity and non-discrimination, et cetera. And please note that just looking inward does not make you self-aware. Have to be intentional, actively working on seeing ourselves clearly, ongoing process. Bruv, I think you mentioned vulnerability, humility, et cetera. It also means self-efficacy. Like you need to have a can-do, I got this, you know, I have some compassion for yourself, have some clarity about what are your strengths, what are you gonna bring? You know I can bring it in this way. So it is indeed about constructive criticism, but it's also in a willingness to have that confidence, to have the sense of what do you have to offer specifically by being fully present, monitoring emotions, empathy, perspective taking, et cetera. So it's really, really important to also find areas to improve upon and actually work on them. That leads me then to just looking just a little bit at this particular framework that I'm using. Before I kind of fast forward through the self-awareness, just to pause for a moment and really ask you, if you're working on self-awareness, make a commitment to work on it more. And to really do it in ways that I've begun to outline. I hope I did it justice in terms of its intentionality. I tend to approach it really more from a standpoint of true curiosity about myself. I try to have self-compassion. I try to love and accept myself as I am, even as I continue to try to be a better human being, period. So I hope this is helpful for you. And it may validate what you're doing. It may also open up something new for you. The 6 traits of a highly inclusive leaders comes from this report that is based on international research, and the researchers developed these traits based on interviewing leaders, looking at data, interviewing persons who are members of their organizations in Australia, Canada, Hong Kong, New Zealand, Singapore, and the US. And they talked about inclusive leadership as a new capability that is vital to the way that leadership is executed, vital. And they came up with these traits. For each trait, they actually describe, what do these persons think about and what do they do? And for the course, I actually took this and deepened it, applied a lot of what I understand about communication, also incorporated a variety of topics from microaggressions, microaffirmations, covering, code switching, active listening, privilege. I mean, so many things that you can look at those words and you can see they're just ripe with ways you can address them in terms of particular behaviors and attitudes. And so they do a great job here. One of the leaders said that they interviewed said, fundamentally, inclusion is a principle that anybody who is good enough to be employed within the team is capable of becoming a leader and developing to the best of their potential. And that is anybody. So that goes back to how I'm framing that this is about everyone. That is to say, inclusive leadership itself, as well as highly inclusive leaders understand this and value this in others in ways that they're intentional about I don't like grooming, about helping others, sponsoring, collaborating, helping them to feel empowered and equipped, genuinely soliciting their input, in terms of reciprocity and so forth. So those are the 6 traits. I'm just going to pause for a moment on commitment specifically, because I think of it as especially relevant when we think about inclusive leadership. I go to the dictionary definition, state or quality of being dedicated. And what their research found is that for highly inclusive leaders, this notion of commitment has to do with 2 things, that these persons, this notion of commitment to DEI is because it's part of their personal value system. Moreover, they have clarity and belief in the business case. So it's both. And they also found that actually the personal values superseded the notion of the bottom line. And so they empower and inspire others to achieve their potential. Here are just briefly some of the behaviors. And again, I go deeper into some of these, but just to give you a sense of how this commitment shows up. Treating everyone with fairness and respect, understanding uniqueness of individuals, striving that each individual feels, treating it as a priority, et cetera, et cetera. Allocating resources. I bolded resources because resources means a lot of different things. One of the things in terms of that responsibility and resources is one of my litmus tests for being in a privileged position that I pick and choose clients now is the leader herself, himself, themselves actually engaged in professional development about diversity, equity, inclusion? Are they doing that self-awareness, et cetera? If not, it's a hard pass for me. And I'm grateful that I'm in that position. So these are some questions. You're going to get these slides. And so these are some questions to think about in terms of your own commitment. What are your personal values? How does it matter the bottom line? To whom might you need to make the business case? Data is really crucial. And oftentimes we neglect to collect the very data we really need or to cross-tabulate it, et cetera. So those are some questions to think about. And I'm now going to ask you you're going to go into breakout groups in just a moment. And I want you to think about what are implications of how I have conceptualized inclusive leadership in service of striving for racial equity. Using this definition, no longer predicted how one fares. However, thinking about racial justice, thinking about root work of inequities, not just their manifestation, policies, practice, etc. So I now want to pause and invite, please, to send everyone to random breakout groups of, I think I asked for 3, is that correct? I'm gonna start sharing my screen as well. And in those groups, the question is, you're just gonna have 5 minutes, and then we'll have a little time to wrap it up. But in those 5 minutes, just share with one another, briefly introduce yourselves. What are some implications for this framing as you think about striving for racial equity as an inclusive leader? So please assign the groups. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for putting the question in, Jenna. right. Are they on their way back now? I think it's 5 minutes.
I'll start bringing them back.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Welcome back. I sure wish I had time to hear what you shared with one another. I had a great conversation with one other person who was in my breakout space. So thank you all very, very much. I invite you to continue to reflect on this and again, trust that it was a helpful conversation for you. I now need to wrap it up, and I want to especially focus on, the good news is I don't see any questions in chat. However, if you have questions, I'm going to close with my email, and again, you're going to get the slides. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or comments. I'm going to close with what are some ways to cultivate inclusive leadership. And it's important to think about this at both the individual as well as organizational and institutional level, always. It's important for you to do what you can, and even in doing what you can and one-on-one, et cetera, is also part of what you do is be committed to a systemic, strategic, sustainable approach. What that means. Try to avoid one and done trainings, et cetera, et cetera. Try to really, again, integrate the ways that you do this work. Deepen your commitment, self-awareness, your circles of influence, we all have them, no matter your role, no matter what, by default or by design, how you show up, what you do, people are watching you for different reasons. And I used to say when I was at CU Boulder and Black students said, it feels like they're watching us. I'm like, give them something to behold, okay? So practice the platinum rule again. Use your privilege for good. All of us have some of it. I'm gonna close with quotes from two sisters that I think really stress this point. Keep learning and growing. There's lots to learn and grow about. If you have ideas, also additional ideas in terms of what to do, please share those into the chat. I'm adding here in chat information about my course. Here are recommendations from the organizational and institutional level that really, again, go back to my points about strategic, systemic, sustainable, also thinking about making this a priority, really deepen the why. Help key people understand why this really matters. That whole bottom line piece is like go way deep into it. That really provides a way that you get people much more on board. Help people see how it connects to their value systems. This is really important. Provide professional development and then hold people accountable. Not fair to say, be more inclusive, go forth, without also equipping them, curate ways that they can succeed at that and then hold them accountable. And finally, acknowledge exemplary staff and units. I want to close with quotes from Sister Audre Lorde and also a young sister. I meant to look up to see if she pronounces her name, so I'm not even going to say it because I don't want to say it incorrectly. And I love her work. So this is about the idea related to being empowered no matter who you are. To acknowledge privilege is the first step in making it available for wider use. Each of us is blessed in some particular way, whether we recognize our blessings or not. And each one of us, somewhere in our lives, must clear a space within that blessing where she can call upon whatever resources are available to her in the name of something that must be done. If you're not familiar with Audre Lorde, I encourage you to look her up, because these words are especially powerful coming from her and the journey she had as self-identified queer activist, woman of color, dedicated to this work, who went through many challenges. And as this sister says, as a leader, this is your responsibility to know yourself, to know your power, and to use it in service of all people. I thank you all so very much. I appreciate the comments I'm seeing in the chat. I wish you nothing but the best as you go forth and cultivate inclusive leadership. Thank you.
Incredible. Thank you so much. Dr. Benitez, I just want to open if you want to share any closing remarks.
No, I'll be frank, Dr. Allen, just amazing. Thank you so much for your work, for all you do, for your insight, the wisdom that you bring to the table in helping everyone in any given respective space that they feel truly understand what that means. I do want to point too that you highlighted that are so significant. For leaders out there in roles of power, supervision, and that type of responsibility, to have the development opportunity and then hold accountability is so important. I see that happen all the time when we expect someone to go and do the work, but they don't really haven't engaged or had a training around the work. That's so key as we see this going on. And then a big one that I think we at times we can miss is understand that people in the workplace, in industry, education, and other areas, when they show up, they have a backpack, and that backpack can come with trauma and wounds and pain as a result of their subjectivities and experiences. I just want to leave those two notes. I love the Platinum Rule. It's so real and matters. Dr. Allen, thank you so very much for joining us. Appreciate you and love you. And to everyone here, thanks for joining us and looking forward to having you in our next session. Everyone, have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the week.
Thank you all. Keep an eye out for information on our next series, which will be October 21st from 11 to 12 p.m. And that will be on allyship. Thank you each for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Hi.